At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Tom, welcome to the show.
Doug, I'm very, very happy to be here. Looking forward to this interview and this dialogue with you today.
Yeah, I am looking forward to it too. I think the whole topic that we're going to talk about is so important in today's culture and what's going on. What I'd love for you to do, though, and I find this always interesting, what's your background and how on earth did you write this book? What brought you to write the book? And you can, name it, let the audience know the name of the book and so forth. But also, what's the motivation behind it, where you decided to write this book and get into this whole discussion?
Well, let me deal with the easy part first, the background. I am the oldest of 10 children, born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. 9 of us are still alive. 7 of us live in Cincinnati, so we see each other quite frequently. And I was the oldest of those 10, so I was the example in many ways, good and bad. And I was educated by the Jesuits, which, if you know anything about the Catholic religion, the Jesuits are the intellectuals. They are the writers and speakers and university professors of the priesthood, if you will. And I think the greatest lesson that the Jesuits taught us, and certainly me, is critical thinking, knowing not just the fact, but the source of the facts and being able to discern well, and so I matriculated from 10 years of Jesuit education into business. I've been in the advertising and marketing field, done everything from pitching clients to, in some cases, writing copy and directing commercials and so forth. I got into entrepreneurship, founded a couple of companies. I had my own consulting firm for many, many years. And we found our way into the corporate turnaround world quite by accident over the years. A colleague of mine and his client felt that I could help his company that was in deep trouble. And I said, I've never done something like this before. And as so often happens, they said, but we know you can. So I got into that world, and it ended up being probably the second major career I had after advertising and marketing, because I started getting calls from bankers and lawyers and accountants who had clients who were in trouble, and that trouble ranged anywhere from tax problems to marketing problems to financial messes and so forth. And so that's where I spent probably the majority of my career, Doug. And this book, sort of diving into the second part of your question, I frequently say to people that this is the book that was never supposed to be a book. One of the passions that I had over the years was collecting quotes from leaders. And those could be people in sports, people in business, obviously, people in politics or religion or science. Anything that I found inspirational to me, I would write it down, predating the days of Google Docs and so forth. But I probably had a notebook or two full of these quotes. And probably about 8 or 9 years ago, I started looking at them in the way of, could this be instructive in a venue other than business? Because every one of these quotes, from the business leaders anyway, was said in the context of their business.
Yes.
It was in a shareholder letter, it was in an annual report, it was in an interview or a speech they gave, and it was decidedly business. And I thought, could they apply elsewhere? And I found that many of them could be instructive in personal relationships. And I started writing essays that included a little biography of the business leader, because many times, to the casual observer, they don't know who this person is.
Yeah.
We all know Steve Jobs and Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, but we don't know Anita Roddick and Carly Fiorina and others like that. So I started writing essays and giving them to my 3 adult children and some friends. And somewhere along the line, somebody said, "We think these ought to be an interview or a newspaper column, rather." And I poo-pooed that idea. I wasn't interested in it. Didn't think it had legs, so to speak. And finally, I sat down one day with a writer friend of mine, a newspaper reporter actually for the business press. He works for a big conglomerate here in the U.S. and showed him a few of these over lunch, and he really liked them and said, "Man, I think these are good. This could be a weekly column. I think your friends are right." And I said, Steve, I don't know if I want to do that, but I did give him permission to pitch his editors. He said he wanted to do that, and so I said, sure, why not? And by that time, I probably had 20 or 30 of these things that I had distributed, and he pitched his editors. They got back to him and said, "Hey, tell your friend these are really good. The problem is we are not an op-ed newspaper. We are a fact-based business weekly reporting on local and regional businesses in a variety of markets around the U.S. And this doesn't have a place for us as more or less an op-ed piece or an advice column." So, but they followed that with saying, "Tell your friend it ought to be a book. If he had enough of these, it could be a book." And so he shared that with me over another lunch, and I said, "No, that's never going to happen." And through a very twisted, winding road with him and a few other people, um, we actually ended up submitting it through him and with him to some publishers that he knew, and I developed a couple on my own. And lo and behold, one of them got back and said, "Yeah, we want to do this thing. When are you going to have the rest of it done?" And, and that became a sprint because the previous, whatever it was, 7 years or so had been casual writing, dabbling, playing with ideas, and now it was gee, when are you going to have this done? So I submitted a final manuscript to them in January of 2023. We spent most of that year with edits and everything else that goes on, as you know, and it got published late in 2023, and here we are today. So
here you are. And what's the name? What's the name of the book? What's the name of the book?
The name of the book is The Business of Relationships, and the subtitle is Using the Wisdom of Great Executives to Create Thriving Personal Connections. But if nobody remembers all of that, it's simply The Business of Relationships, and it's on Amazon.
Well, and you know what I find interesting, and you kind of alluded to it. I've done a little bit of consulting in my life, and what I found interesting was that as I was working with very small business owners, not at your level, but as I was working with small business owners, oftentimes it was their life that was affecting their business. And as we created business protocols, it naturally flowed into their life protocols. And so I'm not sure that you can separate the two. And you kind of alluded to the fact that, here they are talking about business, and yet if you apply it to personal, all of a sudden there's incredible wisdom in what they say. And what really motivated you about relationships? What is the situation today that actually said to you, you know what? I'm going to use these quotes, but I'm going to use these quotes that focus on relationships.
Well, I think for me, it was a relatively easy choice because relationships are important to me and should be important to all of us, whether that is a spousal relationship, a sibling relationship, family relationship, colleagues, friends, etc. I think having a talent for building bridges rather than burning them is something that we all need more of today. And I started to encounter, Doug, some statistics that are just shocking to me. When you say that here in America, for instance, this is a 7.8 almost $8 trillion problem in business with failed relationships, because it impacts productivity. It impacts longevity on the job. employees that are under stress in their relationships are 62%, I think it was, 62% more likely to quit abruptly. We have terms like workplace ghosting, bare minimum Mondays, quiet quitting. All of those things, excuse me, all of those things speak to just failure in our relationships. And I think the one that is saddest to me is that here in America, and I realize we're talking long distance, you're in Thailand, I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, but here in America, in the richest country in the world, arguably the most powerful country in history, a beacon of democracy at times, sometimes better than others. But in this country that has so much going for it, our children are 3 times more likely to grow up in a single parent household than the worldwide average. So you think about that for a minute. It's not 30% more, 15% more. It's 3 times more likely. And I think that speaks to this individualistic society. You alluded to some of it in your comments earlier. This individualistic, I've got mine, hope you get yours mindset that we live in is damning our children to a situation that is just tragic.
Well, and as we look politically at the relationships that are going on, it's just horrendous. And I can't even imagine how that's going to affect our children ultimately, and our grandchildren if that doesn't get handled. And it's interesting that this has really become a focus, I've found, with many people and a concern of how are we going to repair these relationships? How are we going to help these relationships become something of a positive nature? And as you say, and I've never heard that statistic, that they're 3 times more likely to be in a single family home. That's horrendous.
Yeah. It's just tragic. And I have a lot of respect and a lot of regard and a lot of hope for the single parent who is doing his or her job on a daily basis. That is a tough assignment, to be both the father and the mother in the household, regardless of gender. And I think that when you look at something like that, you say, what is that message to children? If a relationship that they look at as foundational, that they want to have confidence in, that they want to enjoy, if you will, the family unit, what does it say to them if those foundational relationships become transactional and become transitional as well? I think that it is not a good message to have that child hold for his or her future. And when agencies are trying to place foster children and can't find homes for them because the system is jammed up, again, these are victimless. Or I'm sorry, the child is a victim, and not able to arguably do anything about the situation on his or her own.
What do you think caused it? What's the root cause of all of this?
I think over time, there's probably several things. One of the stats that I saw recently was the decline in trust, especially in America. Not only institutional trust, but personal trust has declined significantly since the mid 70s. In 1975, it was said by Gallup that about 53% of Americans believed that they could trust each other. That is now 32%.
Wow.
You have 68% of our American population saying, I can't trust another person. I place very little trust. And it started institutionally, certainly. It exacerbated with COVID and the isolation that we felt there. And I think the technology has contributed to it as well. We don't have to trust each other anymore because everything is at our fingertips. We have We have AI to do all the research we want it to do. We have Amazon to deliver all the things we want. We have Grubhub or DoorDash to deliver all the food we could want, and we can isolate. And isolation breeds mistrust. It puts people in an echo chamber of like-minded folks, and anyone outside that echo chamber is frequently not trusted.
Well, and it's interesting is I'm on Facebook and I'm on a number of social media sites because of the podcast and the reels and so forth. And what I find interesting, for instance, even with TikTok, I'll be looking at mine and then kind of checking things over, and here will be a message, and I immediately, most of the time, will go to AI, as you mentioned, and ask the question, is this true? And I will tell you that at least 30% of those presentations that I watch are not true. They're downright lies. And so, yeah, how do you get to a point where if you have the ability and really to check things out, all of a sudden you realize, you know what, we're being lied to on social media. There just isn't the truth anymore.
And how do you vet that? You do it through AI. Certainly, I do too. The proliferation of scams and so forth that are out there preying on people. But I think that speaks to this. We place an awful lot of trust in our machinery, and very little in our people. And I think that's going to have a long-term bad impact on all of us. And I think it's also the messaging that we see, that there used to be, and I don't want to sound like some old person, but it used to be that there were certain things that you almost took for granted. The government may not have been your friend, but it was at least in your corner most of the time. The school systems may not have been the greatest thing for us individually over time, but it was consistent and it was reliable, and I think some of that reliability in the institutions has gone away. And I think when our children look at the fact that even long-term alliances, the relationship of America with NATO, the relationship of America with Japan, and some of the Eastern countries, those things are all of a sudden very transactional and very much, at least in this political environment, very transitory and very much tied to economics, and I think when our kids say, well, if you can't get along with your allies, with people that have been in your corner almost since the Revolutionary War, and certainly since World War II, if you can't get along and have a unified worldview with them, what does that tell me about my potential to have good personal relationships, one-on-one with people? I think we're just sending some awfully bad messaging, Doug.
Well, and it's interesting to me I always kind of look at the root cause. And it's interesting to me. I'm not sure we can discover what the root cause is in this, but to see the infiltration of a lack of trust, an infiltration of, false media, and political leanings, and you know what, I've got to be right, and you're wrong, and so you get that ego in there that has just proliferated to the point where people can't even have honest discussions in many cases. And in many cases, people have lost friends just over the political issues that are going on.
Right.
And these are good friends that they no longer can be in communication with because of that strong ego that says, you know what, I'm right and you're wrong. So here's what's interesting. You have literally in your book, you're kind of using the quotes of major business leaders and so forth. But I found it interesting as I was going through your book that you also get into religions and you get into really going back thousands of years many times and looking at the basis of relationships based on those foundational instruments. And I'd love for you to share with the audience a little bit what you discovered. Obviously, you were with the Jesuits, and wherever you are now, that's fine. But obviously, you have an extreme interest in the various worldwide religions and philosophies, particularly about this topic. And I'd love for you to share with the audience kind of what you have discovered with that.
Well, I think what was amazing to me was when you look at their scriptures, and I chose to look at what I would call the seven major religions, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Islam, etc. Um, I think when you look at their scriptures and their holy writings, if you will, it amazed me to see the parallels and the primacy of relationships. Relationships are built on qualities like trust and integrity, and they're built on perspective and resilience and others. And every one of those religions said remarkably similar things at various times. If you look back to the Buddhist writings and the Tao Te Ching, and you look at the Old Testament Bible, they have some parallels there in terms of the timing of those writings. And it was amazing in different parts of the world, in very different cultures, in very different historical traditions. When it came to relationships, they were remarkably similar in placing those at the nexus, if you will, of good living. That you will not have a good life without good relationships and without community and without engagement. Whether it was Eastern, Western, or anywhere in between, it was pretty amazing to me to see the similarities there. So I think that was the biggest thing with the religions was there was not a single major dialect that didn't place relationships at the center of good living.
Well, and it's fascinating to me. As you say, I've studied a number of them and done the same thing that you have, maybe in a little different way, but just trying to look at and compare the similarities and to look at these similarities that exist. But again, as you say, that focus on relationships, that focus on goodness, on kindness, on understanding is just amazing to me that these are the basis of most of the religions and philosophies. And I find that so fascinating. So as you wrote your book and as you were looking at all of these different quotes, you kind of came up with, I don't know how many, 8, 10 different areas that really make a relationship. I'd love for you to kind of talk about each one a little bit and talk about why each one is important. And I know it starts out with perspective.
Right, right. I would say that, well, first of all, there's 12 qualities that have been widely identified as fundamental to a good personal relationship. Not necessarily a romantic relationship, but it can be familial, it can be platonic, in and out of different venues and so forth. But I think perspective is one of those qualities, one of the 12 that gives you a long-term view of things, gives you the ability to say, this is a speed bump, this is not a mountain. It's saying to the other person that I am taking the long view of this relationship. I am moving toward it with some sense of permanence, and I attach perspective to that. And then you have qualities like trust and honesty and integrity, which are foundational to a relationship. If again, we talked about this earlier already, but if you can't be trusted or you can't trust others, that's going to damage or kill a relationship. Integrity is the same thing. What do you do when nobody's looking is the way I would characterize integrity. And if you are a person who stands by what he or she says and then does it, that to me is integrity. And it doesn't matter if anybody's looking or if there are any consequences to it that are known. It's foundational to you. You have honesty as well. That's pretty easy to explain. You know, the recovery community calls it rigorous honesty. You know, that you want to be intentional about being honest and about you know, taking that care with other people. Then I think you have qualities that are a little bit different. And again, when I looked at these 12, I found them in places like the Harvard Business Review. I found them in places like the Northwestern School of Medicine's journal, marriage.com, NBC News. You know, it was a wide array of different uh, outlets, if you will, that all seem to gravitate towards some of these as being foundational. Not one site named all 12, but there was enough commonality there that you said if I had to pick 12, if I wanted to do one a month, so to speak, being a business guy, 52 essays for 52 weeks and put 13 in each quarter of the book and all that stuff. You know, I gravitated to those 12, and I think the ones that you can look at that are a little bit more um, not as intuitive would be things like risk and change and maybe priority. I think there are other qualities, the qualities of humility and commitment, the quality of resilience, respect. Those are all foundational qualities, and I found it pretty easy to adapt some of these quotes into those areas. You know, and I have some of my favorites that we can talk about or not, but you know, I think there is guidance from these business leaders if you look at it in the context of not what he said, but what could be said about it.
Well, and what comes to my mind is you talk about perspective, for instance. In fact, I want to talk about perspective and change because I think those two are so interrelated. You talk about perspective, but the reality is when we talk, and I love the word perception, an event occurs and we perceive that event based on our own personal beliefs that have been created since childhood. And some of them are what we would say real and true, and others have been those imprints that have come from our parents, our religion, our society, our school, even our DNA. And how do you help someone to start to develop a true and honest perspective rather than a perception that may in fact be affected by all of that, including the fact that even now with everything that's going on with technology and so forth, if you get in and look at the news, or if you get in and are looking at anything social media wise based on AI, they have figured out where your interests are and they keep giving you all of that information when in fact it may not be true perspective. So how do you help people to get to the point where they can actually develop a true perspective? That's question number one. But then where change comes into place is being able to say, you know what, I've been wrong. And I need to change my way of thinking. I need to change my way of behavior, whatever that happens to be. And change, I think, is one of the greatest difficulties that we experience in our life because of our egos and just because of things in general. So how do you work with perspective with people, and how do you work with them being able then to have the courage to make that change?
Well, I think for me, perspective goes back to what is the long-term vision or long-term view or value that you are placing on this relationship, whether that is with your spouse, your child, a colleague, a friend, a golf partner, whatever it is. What value do you place on that and what vision do you have for it? I think people have to ask themselves that question, because if they do, and they answer it in terms of, I place great value on this, I have a vision for the future that our friendship or our marital relationship or my relationship with my sibling is going to be consistent and good and accelerating over the next 5, 10, 15 years. if you have that kind of a vision and a value on the relationship, then I think you will do the things necessary and to accelerate that relationship. I also look at it in terms of what the Stoics always said, and they're a favorite philosophy of mine, among some others maybe, but the Stoics always said that you can't control the circumstance, you can only control the response. And I think if people had a bit more of that uh, mindset, we would all be better off. That what is my response to this going to be in terms of, again, the value I place on a relationship or the vision that I have for it. So I think if we look at it that way and unpack it a little bit and say, I am in this for the long haul. What is the impact of this? The people say the 10-10 rule, 10-10-10 rule, I talk about that a little bit with some people that I speak to about perspective. What is the impact of what just happened in 10 minutes? What is the impact of this in 10 days? What is the impact of this in 10 years? And very frequently, if you look at 10-10-10, and you can put anything on it, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, whatever you want to do. But a lot of times, if you get people talking about that and saying, well, I understand you're really mad at your wife over the fact that she spent X number of dollars on a frivolous purchase, or it's frivolous to you. What's the impact of that going to be in 10 days? Oh, it won't be anything at all. I probably will forget about it. What about 10 weeks? What about 10 years? So a lot of times when you put it in that context, I think it helps people with perspective as well, in controlling their response. And again, going back to the value and the vision that you have for the relationship.
Well, and as you as you look at that perspective, and for instance, in a relationship, and if your perspective is yes, I want this to last, I want this to be good, then comes the necessity of saying, okay, what do I have to change? What do I have to do to contribute to help this to become a good relationship? And also, what is needed from the other individual for this to become a good relationship and a long-lasting relationship? How do you address that?
Well, you gave me an in there, and I want to talk about change a little bit, but I want to dive back into perspective just for a minute, because I think I can offer you two quotes from the book and two business leaders that are widely acknowledged as people that just about everyone respects. The first one is Steve Jobs. Okay, the founder of Apple, in and out of Apple, as we know, with the John Scully transition. He walks away from Apple. He founds Pixar. He founds Next Computers. He sells that back to Apple. He becomes the new CEO, and from there, it's that great run of success with iPhone and iPad and all of that. But Steve Jobs said something, and this was in a speech in 2005 to the graduating class of Stanford University. And it was post-cancer for him. He had survived that first scare, eventually died of cancer, as we know, in 2011. But in 2005, he gave this speech to the Stanford graduating class. And he said, remembering that I'll be dead soon is one of the biggest tools I use to make major decisions. And that talked to me powerfully about perspective, because it talks about the fact that the short time that we're here is not as significant as we think it will be in the history of the human race. That all of us are going to fall victim to being remembered by very few people for a very short period of time. And I think Jobs captured that in that quote, talking about that. And that spoke to me powerfully about perspective. The one that speaks to me about change came from a speech that Jack Welch gave to his business leaders at General Electric when he was a pretty new CEO. And Jack was a tough guy, and not everybody liked what he did, but the fact is, He tripled shareholder value. He did 200 acquisitions. He diversified into many different businesses and made this lumbering industrial giant more nimble in his 20 years. And Jack gave a speech to these business leaders, the heads of GE Finance and GE Aerospace and GE Medical and all the different divisions. And he said to them, he said, if you are not number one or number two in your marketplace, I will fix you, close you, or sell you. So change before you have to. And those 5 words, I've used that in many different contexts. Change before you have to. But in the context of a relationship, change before you have to. The financial irresponsibility that's going to wreck your family. Change before you have to. The passive aggressive nature with your kids that is not contributing to the good relationship. Change before you have to your bad temper. Change before you have to the budding addiction. I think those are really powerful words from a guy who clearly didn't say them in the context of a relationship. He was warning his business leaders that you're going to be fixed, closed, or sold unless you are number one or number two. So get on the stick. So I think those two, when you talk about perspective and you talk about change, I can't think of too many quotes that would be better guidances for us in relationships than those two, if you're looking for perspective and change.
Yeah, and I love the quote, change before you have to. And again, I think it goes to the mindset of all of us is if we are in any relationship that we want to have continue, we really need to look at what do I need to change? So often we tend to blame everybody else, but we never take the responsibility to say, what do I need to change to make this relationship better? And when we do that and start to do that transformational introspective work, that makes a big change. And I know one of the things you talk about is that transformation wisdom. I'd love for you to share with the audience what you mean by that. What is transformative wisdom and how does that apply in our lives as we want to develop these relationships?
Well, I think transformative wisdom to me would always be, what did I do with it? Isn't there an old saying out there that knowledge without action is wasteful, and action without knowledge is foolish? I think that's somewhere in one of the Eastern texts that I read. But I think that's a good little mantra to have, Doug, is that if you have wisdom and you've acquired it because of the people you're with, because of what you read, because of what you believe, because of what you've been taught, that's one thing. It's great. There's a lot of smart people out there, but what did you actually do with it? How did it make a difference in your life and the lives of those people around you? And I think, it just came to me as we were talking here, but I think Bill Gates is another quote that I had in my chapter on change. And Gates said, "Success is a lousy teacher because it seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose." And when you think about that, that is part of this stew, if you will, in and around transformative wisdom. He's saying that, just because you succeeded here or there doesn't mean that you can put things on autopilot. Don't be seduced by the fact that you can't lose just because you built 3 companies, you have a 7 handicap, you're driving a Ferrari, and guess what? Your life stinks. Your relationships with your kids stink. Your relationship with your wife is very transactional, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have a lot of friends. You have a lot of acquaintances. That seduction of success really traps a lot of us, I think. Trapped me certainly for a while and continues to challenge me.
Well, and I love what you said about wisdom and action. And I love that quote because the reality is yes, I think all of us, get ideas, we develop some wisdom about something, but unless we're willing to take the next step and do something about it, nothing happens.
Yep,
Now, what would
absolutely.
you say? How could that apply to today's culture in the U.S.?
Boy, that's a tall order. Where do we start? How much time do we have?
Not much.
I think here in the US, the biggest challenge is that we are exceedingly lonely and we are definitely excessive in our individualism. And I think that recipe there, those two things that you would think would be counter to each other. I don't want to be lonely, therefore I can't be individualistic. The US is saying, no, we want to be both. We aspire to be individualistic, and the price of that is loneliness, and that's okay. 60% of us are now saying in the US that our constant companion is loneliness. And a lot of that is cultural and a lot of it is technological, certainly. But I think, again, that to me is one of the crux issues that we have to grapple with is getting back into community, getting back into relating with one another, getting back into groups and clubs and associations and so forth that contribute to society, that go outside of ourselves, because we are that individualistic culture.
And get that conversation and communication to the point where you can say, Doug, this is what I really feel about this. And I can say, hey, Tom, I really understand that. I don't necessarily agree, but let's talk about that a bit. And all of a sudden, as you're starting to talk about those things, that relationship starts to redevelop. And as you say, that can only happen when we're in a community, when we're developing those communities together, and when we're willing to listen and not necessarily let our ego get in the way of judgment.
Yes, I could not have said it better. I mean, I think that's one of the characteristics that we've lost is we all want to speak, but we don't want to listen. And we don't take the time to really investigate. You can talk about the political differences or religious differences we have, but where did I'll call it tenderness in the questions come in, where if you and I were engaging and you were not believing in what I believed in, why don't I say, Doug, can you tell me a little bit about why you believe that? Was part of that belief due to some insecurity in your upbringing? Why would you think that people can't be trusted? And get the other person talking about that, not to convince them necessarily to your way, but to clarify the factors that are causing them to make this decision. Nobody suddenly rallied around Donald Trump when he came down the escalator in 2015, spouting what he spouted off. There was a deeply disaffected population that had been brewing as an undercurrent probably since the early 2000s. He just happened to tap into that vein. But would it help to talk to people and say, what caused this? What was it about American society that turned you in this direction? Just trying to find out and be educated about it, because I think with education, as we understand each other better, then we can relate to one another better. You said it yourself just earlier.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. Well, as we close, how do people find your book again?
Okay. They find it on Amazon, and it is The Business of Relationships.
Great. And what would be your final message to the audience?
Well, I think you stole a little bit of my thunder earlier, but
Sorry about
possibly
that.
I'll possibly put it differently. If you want a good relationship, okay, I think there's two easy ways to do it. Realize that every problem is a relationship problem. The CEOs that I spotlighted in the book were masters at creating good relationships. That's why they're as well paid as they are, because they have to relate well to shareholders and customers and vendors and regulatory agencies and so forth. So I think the understanding that always look for the problem in the relationship. before you try to solve the issue. The other thing I would say is be fearless about looking in the mirror. If you want a great relationship, look in the mirror and say, where's it breaking down because of me? Again, the recovery community has a saying that I believe they say, keep your own side of the street clean. When you look in the mirror, you make sure that your side of the street is clean. Where do I need to improve? Where do I need to change? Where do I need to have greater understanding or a greater sense of trust or a more resilience, if you will, in this circumstance so that it doesn't become, again, the speed bump that becomes a mountain.
Oh, I love it. Well, Tom, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And I find it fascinating that you've been able to get all of these quotes and again, from people who have been so successful in business, and yet their quotes are so applicable in our everyday life and in our everyday relationships.
Well, I'll close with one that's a favorite because we didn't mention many females in this dialogue, but Sheryl Sandberg, who was, Google and Facebook fame and so forth, and had some unfortunate circumstances, the largest of which was losing her husband while they were on vacation. But Sheryl Sandberg said, each one of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. That spoke to me about resilience, but you could also go back to the beginning of the book with perspective and say, maybe that's a perspective as well. Each one of us, not the ones who pray the most, not the ones who give the most money to their college, not the ones who smile the most, at Christmas parties. It is each one of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think that's a guidepost that we all could use.
Well, I appreciate that, Tom. Thanks so much. I
All
really
right.
appreciate your input and your contribution. I think that's fantastic.
Doug, thank you very much for your time and your wisdom today. It was a wonderful discussion. Great way to start the day in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Oh, yeah. And folks, thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it and look forward to having you join us again soon. So this is Dr. Duck saying namaste.